There is a photograph taken at the memorial service for John F. Kennedy Jr., Carolyn Bessette Kennedy, and Lauren Bessette in July 1999. In it, you can see the Kennedy family. You can see the friends. You can see the faces that the cameras had been trained on for years. And somewhere in that crowd, attending a service for two sisters she had lost in a single night, was a woman the world has never once stopped to ask about. Her name is Lisa Bessette. She is Lauren's identical twin. She is Carolyn's younger sister, and she is the only Bessette sister still alive. The world spent 25 years building a mythology around the people on that plane. John Kennedy Jr., the most eligible bachelor in America, the son of Camelot, the man who flew anyway. Carolyn Bessette Kennedy, the Calvin Klein publicist who became the most scrutinized woman in New York, who married into a family that consumed her, who did not want to get on that plane. Lauren Bessette, the Morgan Stanley vice president, the woman nobody named, the one who was also there. And then there is Lisa, the one who stayed behind, who received a phone call on the night of the 16th of July, 1999, that told her that both of her sisters were gone. Not one, both. In a single conversation, in a single night. I am Mary. And today, this channel is going to do something that 25 years of Kennedy coverage has never done. We are going to say her name. Not as a footnote to Carolyn's story. Not as a detail in Lauren's story. Not as a supporting character in the mythology of a man whose name the world already knows. As a person, as a sister, as the woman who survived the story that everybody else has spent a quarter century telling. Because here is what the record shows about Lisa Bessette. She was 29 years old on the night the plane went down. She had grown up in Greenwich, Connecticut, with her mother, Anne Freeman, her older sister, Carolyn, and her twin sister, Lauren. The three Bessette girls described by people who knew them as close, as loyal, as the kind of sisters who remained genuinely present in each other's lives, even as those lives took them to different cities and different worlds. Carolyn had gone to New York and into the orbit of the most famous bachelor in America, and into a marriage that cost her things the world watched, but never fully understood. Lauren had gone to New York and into investment banking at Morgan Stanley, where she had built a career that placed her among the most capable people in her field. She was a vice president. She was 34 years old. She had worked for everything she had, and Lisa had done the same. Quietly, without a famous husband, without a public profile, without the specific, consuming attention that had attached itself to Carolyn the moment she became Mrs. Kennedy. She was an investment banker. She was Lauren's twin. She was Carolyn's sister. And on the evening of the 16th of July, 1999, she was not on the plane. This is the detail that the coverage of this story has always treated as incidental. A fact to be noted and moved past. Lisa Bessette was not on the plane. But I want to sit with that sentence for a moment longer than the coverage ever has. Because that sentence, Lisa Bessette was not on the plane, is the entire architecture of the rest of her life. Every decision she has made in the 25 years since. Every choice to remain private. Every refusal of every interview request. Every year that has passed without a public statement, a memoir, a documentary, a single word to the press. All of it begins with that sentence. She was not on the plane, and everything that being not on the plane means the specific, impossible weight of being the one who stayed, the one who survived, the one who received the phone call instead of being on the receiving end of someone else's, is something that the coverage of this story has never once treated as worthy of serious attention. The world asked who Carolyn was. The world asked who Lauren was. The world asked what John was thinking when he filed the flight plan. Nobody asked what it cost the girl who stayed behind. Nobody asked what happened to Lisa Bessette after July 1999. Nobody said her name. This video is going to, before the crash, before the phone call, before everything that July night took from her permanently, Lisa Bessette grew up as one of three sisters in a family that the world would later claim to know everything about. What that family actually looked like from the inside, who the three Bessette girls were before any Kennedy existed in their story, is coming. And it is the foundation of everything that follows. To understand what Lisa Bessette lost on the night of July 16, 1,000 999. You have to understand what the three Bessette sisters actually were to each other before any of the rest of it began. Before the Kennedy name. Before the paparazzi outside the Tribeca apartment. Before the Calvin Klein office and the Morgan Stanley boardroom and the small plane that filed a flight plan to Martha's Vineyard on a hazy summer evening. Before all of it, there were three girls in Greenwich, Connecticut. And their story does not begin with John Kennedy Jr. It begins with Anne Freeman. Anne Freeman was the mother of the three Bessette sisters. She was, by the accounts of people who knew the family, a woman of considerable intelligence and quiet strength, the kind of woman who raised three daughters to be capable and self-directed in a way that did not require anyone's permission or approval. She had been married to William Bessette, the girl's father. The marriage ended. Anne remarried to a man named Richard Freeman, a prominent orthopedic surgeon in Connecticut. The family settled into Greenwich life with the specific, contained privacy of a family that had no interest in being observed. This is where the three Bessette girls grew up. Greenwich, Connecticut, a town that has always understood the difference between having money and displaying it. A town where the children of the successful go to school together and play sports together and grow up with an understanding of the world that comes from being raised inside a certain kind of American privilege without ever being required to perform that privilege for an audience. Carolyn Jane Bessette was born on the 7th of January, 1966. She was the oldest. By accounts from people who knew her in those years, Carolyn was the kind of person who made rooms, rearranged themselves around her without appearing to try, not in a calculated way. Not in the way that someone who has studied the effect of their own presence produces it deliberately, but in the specific, natural way of someone who was simply, as multiple people have described her across multiple accounts, extraordinary to be around. She was funny. She was warm. She was also, and this is the detail that the mythology of Carolyn Bessette Kennedy has almost entirely erased, a serious person. A person who read, who thought carefully about things, who was not the glossy surface that the Kennedy world and the New York tabloids would later reduce her to. She attended St. Mary's High School in Greenwich. She went on to Boston University, where she graduated with a degree in elementary education. She was not a fashion person by training. She became one by circumstance, by a career that moved from retail to Calvin Klein's publicity office, where her specific combination of taste and intelligence and the ability to make people feel seen made her exceptionally good at something she had not necessarily planned to do for the rest of her life. But before Boston University, before Calvin Klein, before John Kennedy Jr. appeared at a wedding in 1994, and her life reorganized itself around a name that was never going to leave her alone. She was the oldest Bessette sister. She was Carolyn. Lauren Marie Bessette was born in May 1968, 2 years after Carolyn. And from the first moments of Lauren's life, she was not alone. Because Lauren was a twin, Lisa Ann Bessette entered the world at the same moment as her sister. Same face, same genetic architecture. Two people who had shared the first 9 months of their existence and would go on to share something that twins who remain close describe as impossible to fully explain to people who have not experienced it, the specific, daily awareness of another person whose interior life you understand, not because you have been told about it, but because something in the way you were made gives you direct access to it. Lauren and Lisa grew up together in the way that close twins grow up, inseparable in the specific sense that their separateness was always understood against the backdrop of their connection. They were not identical in personality. Twins rarely are, despite sharing identical faces. But they were, by every account from people who knew them, genuinely close in the way that the best kind of siblings are close. The kind where distance does not diminish the relationship, because the relationship is not dependent on proximity. What do we know about Lisa specifically in those Greenwich years? Less than we know about Carolyn, considerably less than we know about Lauren, because Lisa was, and this word will appear again in this video, in a context that breaks your heart, the quiet one. Not quiet in the sense of withdrawn, not quiet in the sense of absent or uninteresting or without presence. Quiet in the specific sense that she did not seek attention, and the attention did not find her. She moved through her life with the kind of self-containment that some people are simply born with, the ability to be fully present in a room without requiring the room to notice. She attended school in Greenwich. She went on to build a career in finance, the same world that Lauren had entered at Morgan Stanley. The two twins, in different firms, in the same city, doing versions of the same work, close enough to have dinner, close enough to call on a Tuesday afternoon for no particular reason, close enough that the specific texture of each other's daily life was known and available and ongoing. And Carolyn was there too, in New York, in the Tribeca loft with John, in the crosshairs of a press that had decided she was their property. The three Bessette sisters in their early 30s, in New York City, in the late 1990s, were still the three Bessette girls from Greenwich, still connected to Anne Freeman, still connected to each other, still the family that had been built quietly, without performance, in a town that understood the value of privacy. And here is the specific, documented detail about their family dynamic that the coverage of the crash has always treated as a footnote, and that this video is going to treat as the center of the story it actually is. When John Kennedy Jr. and Carolyn Bessette were struggling when the marriage was under the specific, relentless pressure of public scrutiny and paparazzi, and the Kennedy family's management of its own mythology, it was her family that Carolyn turned to. Not the Kennedys, her family. Anne Freeman, Lauren, Lisa. The women who had known her before any of it. The women who had no investment in the Kennedy mythology. The women who knew her as Carolyn, not as Mrs. Kennedy, not as the most scrutinized woman in New York, not as the difficult one or the complicated one or the obstacle in someone else's love story, as Carolyn. And when the plane went down on the 16th of July, 1999, it did not only take John Kennedy Jr. from the world. It took Carolyn from Anne Freeman. It took Lauren from Anne Freeman. It took Carolyn from Lisa. It took Lauren from Lisa. One night, one phone call, two sisters. The three Bessette girls from Greenwich were reduced by half in the time it takes to answer a telephone. And the girl who stayed behind the quiet one, the twin, the sister who was not on the plane, was left to carry something that the world was already in the process of turning into a Kennedy story. Not a Bessette story, a Kennedy story. And in that transformation in the specific, institutional machinery of how the Kennedy name consumed the narrative of that crash, the way it had consumed the narrative of everything it had ever touched, Lisa Bessette disappeared. Not all at once, not dramatically, but steadily, quietly. In the way of someone who understood that the world was not going to tell her sister's story honestly, and who made a decision documented by her permanent, 25-year silence that if the world was going to get it wrong, she was not going to help it get it wrong more efficiently. She went quiet. She has stayed quiet. And the question of what that silence costs a person, what it means to lose both of your sisters in one night, and then watch the world spend 25 years making it about someone else, is the question that the rest of this video is going to ask. When John Kennedy Jr. and Carolyn Bessette married in September 1996, Lisa Bessette was there. At a secret ceremony on a small island off the coast of Georgia, in a church with no electricity, in a dress designed by Narciso Rodriguez, Carolyn married the most famous bachelor in America. What Lisa saw from inside that ceremony, and what she watched happen to her sister in the 3 years between the wedding and the crash, is the part of this story that nobody has told from her perspective. That is coming. In September 1996, Carolyn Bessette married John F. Kennedy Jr. on Cumberland Island, Georgia. The ceremony was held at the First African Baptist Church, a building with no electricity, lit by candlelight, on a barrier island off the coast of Georgia that could only be reached by boat. The guest list was small. The secrecy was total. The dress designed by Narciso Rodriguez was a pearl silk crepe that has since been described as one of the most beautiful wedding dresses of the 20th century. Lisa Bessette was there. She stood in that candlelit church and watched her older sister marry the most famous man in America. She watched Carolyn become something that Carolyn had not chosen and could not control, a public figure, a Kennedy wife, a woman whose face would now be property of every newspaper and television camera in the English-speaking world. And Lisa, the quiet one, the twin, the sister who moved through her life without seeking attention, watched all of it from the inside. What she saw in the 3 years between that wedding and the crash is documented in fragments. Not through Lisa's own words, she has never given those, but through the accounts of people who were close to the couple, close to Carolyn, close to the family during those years. What those accounts show is this. The marriage between Carolyn Bessette and John Kennedy Jr. was from the beginning under a pressure that most marriages never experience and that almost none survive intact. The paparazzi outside their Tribeca loft were not occasional, they were permanent. Carolyn could not leave the building to buy coffee without being photographed. She could not argue with John on a sidewalk without the argument appearing in every tabloid in America the following morning, which is precisely what happened in March 1996, 7 months before the wedding, when photographs of the couple fighting in Washington Square Park were published worldwide. In those photographs, John is pulling at Carolyn's hand. Carolyn is pulling away. Both of them are clearly in the middle of something private and painful. And the world published those photographs without hesitation and without apology, because she was going to be a Kennedy. And Kennedys did not have private lives. Carolyn had not agreed to this. She had agreed to marry John. She had not agreed to become an institution. Lisa watched this happen. She watched her sister, who had been, by every account, warm and funny and self-possessed and genuinely extraordinary to be around, begin to change under the specific, relentless pressure of being Mrs. Kennedy. She watched Carolyn lose weight in ways that concerned the people around her. She watched her sister become more private, more guarded, more careful about who she trusted and what she said. She watched the woman she had grown up with become someone the world thought it owned. And here is the specific, documented detail that makes Lisa's position in this story uniquely painful. She could not fix it. She could be present. She could be available. She could be the person Carolyn called when the weight of being Mrs. Kennedy became too heavy to carry alone. And by the accounts of people close to the family she was, the Bessette family remained a genuine source of support and connection for Carolyn during a marriage that the Kennedy world never fully accepted her into. But Lisa could not change the fundamental architecture of what her sister had married into. She could not make the photographers leave. She could not make the Kennedy family treat Carolyn as a person rather than an asset. She could not make the world stop consuming a woman who had never asked to be consumed. What she could do, and what the documentary record suggests she did, was remain. Show up. Be the sister who knew Carolyn before any of it. Be the person in the room who remembered who Carolyn actually was. Lauren was doing the same thing. From her position at Morgan Stanley, from her life that was genuinely her own, built on her own terms, in her own field, with her own achievements, that had nothing to do with anyone's famous last name. The two Bessette sisters, who had not married into the Kennedy world, remained anchored to each other and to Carolyn, in a way that the accounts of this period suggest was genuinely important to all three of them. And then came the summer of 1999. John Kennedy Jr. had broken his ankle in a paragliding accident in May. He was flying with a leg brace. He had approximately 300 hours of flight experience. He did not have an instrument rating, which meant he was not certified to fly by instruments alone, without visual reference to the ground. On the evening of July 16, the conditions over Long Island Sound and the waters approaching Martha's Vineyard were hazy. Visibility was reduced. It was the kind of evening that experienced pilots with instrument ratings treat with caution, and that pilots without instrument ratings are specifically, formally, legally not supposed to navigate alone. John filed a flight plan to Martha's Vineyard. They were flying to attend the wedding of his cousin, Rory Kennedy, the youngest child of Robert and Ethel Kennedy, born 6 months after her father's assassination. Carolyn was on the plane. Lauren was on the plane. Lisa was not. Why was Lisa not on the plane? This is the question that the coverage of this story has never asked directly. The accounts that exist suggest that Lauren was traveling to the wedding with the couple that she had arranged to fly with John and Carolyn rather than taking a commercial flight. Lauren's presence on that plane was a logistical decision, made in the ordinary way that travel decisions are made among people who are close to each other. Lisa's absence was similarly ordinary. She was not going to the wedding. She had her own life, her own schedule, her own plans for that weekend that did not include a flight to Martha's Vineyard. The difference between Lisa's life and Lauren's death was a scheduling decision, not a premonition, not a warning, not a dramatic last-minute choice. A scheduling decision. And the specific, unbearable randomness of that, the fact that Lisa Bessette is alive because of the ordinary logistics of a summer weekend, is the thing that the coverage of the crash has never sat with long enough to understand what it means. Because understanding what it means requires thinking about Lisa. And the world was not thinking about Lisa. The world was thinking about the Kennedys. On the night of the 16th of July, 1999, the plane disappeared from radar at 9:41 p.m. The search began. And somewhere in New York, Lisa Bessette did not yet know what had happened, what the hours between the plane disappearing and the phone call looked like, and what that phone call said, is the part of this story nobody has ever told from her perspective, that is coming. The plane disappeared from radar at 9:41 p.m. on the 16th of July, 1999. John Kennedy Jr. had been flying for approximately 40 minutes. He had departed from Essex County Airport in Fairfield, New Jersey, at approximately 8:38 p.m., later than planned, in conditions that were darker and hazier than they would have been at the original departure time. 3 pilots who knew him had advised against flying that evening. The conditions were not appropriate for a pilot without an instrument rating. The haze over the water made visual navigation, the only kind of navigation John was certified to perform, extremely difficult. He flew anyway. At 9:39 p.m., the plane began a series of erratic movements. It turned. It descended rapidly. The NTSB investigation would later determine that the cause was spatial disorientation, the specific, documented phenomenon in which a pilot flying without visual reference to the horizon loses the ability to determine which way is up. The body's inner ear sends false signals. The instruments say one thing, the body says another. And a pilot without instrument training does not have the specific, drilled muscle memory to trust the instruments over the body's insistent, wrong conviction. The plane entered the water at approximately 9:41 p.m. There were no survivors. The search began. The Coast Guard was notified. The Kennedy family was notified. The specific, well-practiced machinery of managing a Kennedy crisis began to assemble itself with the speed and efficiency of an institution that had been doing this for 40 years. And somewhere in New York City, Lisa Bessette did not yet know. This is the part of the story that has no documentation, because what happened in the hours between the plane disappearing and the phone call reaching Lisa is something that only Lisa knows, and Lisa has never spoken. What the documented record shows is this. The plane was reported overdue at approximately 10 p.m. Family members and friends began to be notified through the night. By the early hours of July 17, it was clear that something had gone catastrophically wrong. The search was the largest peacetime Coast Guard operation in the history of the region. Ships, aircraft, divers, the full apparatus of a government mobilized by the death of a Kennedy. Anne Freeman, the mother, was notified. Lisa, the surviving twin, the surviving sister, was notified. Whatever that phone call said, whatever words were used, whatever the voice on the other end of the line communicated in the early hours of the 17th of July, 1999, it told Lisa Bessette that both of her sisters were gone. Not one, both. Lauren, her twin, the person who had shared her face, the person who had grown up beside her in Greenwich, the person who had entered the same world of finance, the person whose daily existence had been, for 31 years, the most familiar presence in Lisa's life, and Carolyn, her older sister, the one who had gone before, the one who had moved to New York and become something extraordinary, and then married into something that consumed her, the one who had needed, in the last years of her life, the specific kind of support that only her own family could give her, both of them. gone. In a single phone call, in a single night, the wreckage was found on the ocean floor on July 20. The bodies were recovered. All three were cremated. On the 22nd of July 1999, the United States Navy scattered their ashes at sea, off the coast of Martha's Vineyard, from the deck of the USS Briscoe. There was no grave. There was no headstone. There was nowhere to go. Lisa Bessette had lost both of her sisters, and the institution that had consumed the living version of Carolyn now consumed the dead version too, organizing the memorial, managing the narrative, determining how the story would be told, and to whom, and in what terms. The Bessette family and Freeman, Lisa, were present. They were acknowledged. They were, by all accounts, treated with the formal consideration that the circumstances required, but they were not the Kennedys. And this was, at its foundation, being managed as a Kennedy story. The memorial service held at St. Thomas More Church in New York City on July 23 was attended by the Kennedy family, by political figures, by celebrities, by the full apparatus of American public life that attends the death of a Kennedy. The eulogies spoke of John. They spoke of Carolyn. Lauren was mentioned. Lisa stood in that church, the surviving twin, the surviving sister, the girl who stayed behind and listened to the world mourn the people she had loved in a language that was not quite the language she would have used. That organized the loss around a Kennedy name that had been the source of so much of the difficulty in the first place. And when it was over, she left. And she did not come back. Not to public life, not to interviews, not to the documentaries that began appearing within years of the crash, not to the books, not to the television specials, not to the FX series that aired in February 2026 and depicted her sister Carolyn's life in ways that Carolyn's friends and family described as fictional. And that prompted Daryl Hannah to write an op-ed in the New York Times. Lisa Bessette said nothing about any of it. She has said nothing about any of it for 25 years. And the question of what that silence is, whether it is grief or anger or dignity, or simply the reasonable decision of a woman who understood that the world was not going to get it right and chose not to participate in the getting it wrong, is the question that this video cannot answer. Because Lisa Bessette has not told us. And that refusal that sustained 25-year decision to remain outside the narrative is the most eloquent thing she has ever said about what happened. After the memorial, after the ashes were scattered, and the Kennedy machinery moved on to the next thing, Anne Freeman and Lisa Bessette were left with a silence that the world had already decided to fill with its own version of events. What the Kennedy estate's treatment of the Bessette family looked like in the months and years after the crash, and what the reported settlement actually meant is coming. And it is the part of the story that tells you everything about whose loss the institution considered worth managing. The Kennedy estate was valued at approximately $100 million at the time of John Kennedy, Jr.'s death. His will, signed in 1997, 2 years after his mother Jackie's death, and 2 years before the crash, left the bulk of his estate to his charitable foundation, the Kennedy Foundation. Carolyn Bessette Kennedy was named as a beneficiary. Lauren Bessette was named as a beneficiary. Anne Freeman, the mother who had raised the 2 women who died on that plane, received a reported settlement of approximately $15 million from the Kennedy estate in the months following the crash. $15 million. That number has been reported across multiple sources. It represents the Kennedy family's financial acknowledgement of what the crash had cost the Bessette family. It also represents something else. A settlement is not an apology. A settlement is not an acknowledgement of responsibility. A settlement is a legal instrument that resolves a financial claim and in most cases includes terms that limit what the receiving party can say publicly about the circumstances that produced it. Anne Freeman accepted the settlement. Lisa, by all documented accounts, was not a named party in the public reporting of the settlement terms. And the silence that followed was total. Now here is what the documented record shows about how the Kennedy world managed the Bessette family's place in the story of the crash in the years that followed. The books came first. Several were published within years of the crash. They told the story of John Kennedy Jr., his career, his marriage, his flying, his death. They told the story of Carolyn, the woman he had loved, the marriage that had been difficult, the life that had been consumed by the Kennedy name. Lauren appeared in those books as she had appeared in the coverage of the crash, as a presence, a detail, a fact. The vice president, who was also on the plane, the sister, who had come along. Lisa appeared in some of them briefly, as the surviving twin, as the family member who had not spoken, as a closed door. The documentaries followed the books. The television specials followed the documentaries. And with each new iteration of the story, each new retelling, each new dramatization, each new excavation of what the Kennedy-Bessette marriage had looked like from the inside, the same organizational principle applied. This was a Kennedy story. The Bessettes were supporting characters, even in their own grief, even in the specific, documented fact that Anne Freeman had lost 2 daughters in a single night, that Lisa had lost both of her sisters, that the Bessette family's loss was, by any measure of human suffering, equal to and in some ways exceeding the Kennedy family's loss, because the Kennedys had lost 1 person where the Bessettes had lost 2. None of that reorganized the story. The story remained organized around the Kennedy name. And here is the specific, documented detail that tells you the most about how the institution processed the Bessette family's existence in the aftermath. The annual memorials, the gatherings at the site where the ashes were scattered, the moments of public acknowledgement that occurred each July 16 were Kennedy events. Kennedy family members attended. Kennedy family statements were issued. The Bessette family, when they appeared at all in the coverage of those memorials, appeared as guests in a grief that the Kennedy name had claimed as its primary property. Anne Freeman, whose daughters are buried in the same ocean off the same coast, has never issued a public statement about any of it. Lisa Bessette, whose twin sister and whose older sister are in that ocean, has never issued a public statement about any of it. And the question of whether that silence is chosen or enforced, whether it is the dignity of women who have decided that their grief belongs to them and not to the world, or whether it is the silence of people who understood that the machinery around them was not designed to amplify their version of events, is not a question this video can answer definitively, but it is a question that the 25 years of Kennedy-Bessette coverage has never asked seriously enough. Because asking it seriously requires treating the Bessette family as the center of a story that the world has always placed them at the edges of. It requires saying that Anne Freeman's loss matters as much as Ted Kennedy's loss. It requires saying that Lisa Bessette's grief, the specific, private, sustained grief of the twin who survived, of the sister who received the phone call, of the woman who has spent 25 years watching the world tell her sister's story in someone else's language, matters as much as the grief of any Kennedy. It requires saying her name, Lisa Bessette, not as a footnote, as a person. As the center of the story, she has been living quietly, privately, without permission or acknowledgement for 25 years. In the years after the crash, Lisa Bessette disappeared from public life so completely that the people who cover this story professionally have almost no information about where she went or what her life looks like now. What the documented record shows about the choices she made, and what those choices tell us about who she is the part of this story that requires the most careful telling that is coming. After the memorial service in July 1999, Lisa Bessette left, not dramatically, not with a statement, not with a public declaration of intent to withdraw from the world that had consumed her sisters. She simply stopped being visible. She left New York. The specific details of where she went and what she built in the years that followed are not part of the documented public record, because Lisa has kept them out of it with a consistency and a determination that has lasted for 25 years and shows no signs of changing. What the documented record does show, in fragments, in the accounts of people who knew the family peripherally, in the specific absence of her name from every subsequent iteration of the story, is this. She did not give interviews. In the weeks after the crash, when every journalist in America was looking for people who could speak to what Carolyn and Lauren had been like, what the marriage had looked like from the inside, what the family dynamic had been, Lisa said nothing. In the months after the crash, when the books were being written and the documentary projects were being developed and the producers were making calls, Lisa said nothing. In the years after the crash, when the anniversaries came around and the cable networks aired retrospectives and the magazines published "Where Are They Now" pieces about everyone connected to the story, Lisa said nothing. In 2022, when the Netflix docuseries Harry and Meghan demonstrated that the market for intimate access to the private lives of people adjacent to famous families was enormous and profitable, Lisa said nothing. In February 2026, when the FX series Love Story depicted Carolyn's life in ways that people who loved her described as fictional and damaging, Lisa said nothing. 25 years. Not one word. Now I want to be precise about what this silence tells us, and what it does not tell us. It does not tell us that Lisa is destroyed, that she is unable to function, that her life has been defined entirely by loss in the way that the coverage of this story tends to assume about the people adjacent to Kennedy tragedies. What it tells us is that she made a decision. A specific, sustained, consistently maintained decision that the story of her sisters, the real story, the one that existed before the Kennedy name and continued to exist inside the Kennedy world and survived the Kennedy crash, was not going to be told by her for the benefit of people who had already demonstrated that they were going to get it wrong. She had watched what happened when the world told Carolyn's story. She had watched Carolyn become Mrs. Kennedy instead of Carolyn Bessette. She had watched Lauren become the one who was also there instead of Lauren Bessette, Vice President, 34 years old, extraordinary in her own right. She had watched the memorial become a Kennedy event. She had watched the settlement become a number in a news article. She had watched 25 years of documentaries and books and television specials, and finally a streaming series, all of them organized around the Kennedy name, all of them treating her sisters as supporting characters in someone else's mythology. And she had said nothing. Because she understood with the specific, clear-eyed intelligence of a woman who had worked in finance, who had watched the machinery of narrative management operate at close range for 3 years of her sister's marriage and 25 years of her sister's death, that saying something would not change the story. It would only give the story more material. And Lisa Bessette was not interested in being material. She was interested in living her life. Whatever that life looks like now, wherever she is, whatever she has built in the 25 years since the phone call, whoever she has become in the privacy she has guarded, with a consistency that deserves acknowledgement rather than the occasional tabloid notation that she remains unavailable for comment. She is still Lisa Bessette. She is still the twin who survived. She is still the sister who received the phone call. She is still the girl from Greenwich who stood in a candlelit church in September 1996 and watched her older sister marry into something that was going to be very hard. And she is still the person who has spent 25 years refusing to let the world flatten her sisters into a Kennedy story. That refusal, sustained across a quarter century, against the full weight of a culture that has never stopped being interested in this story, is not nothing. It is, in its specific and quiet way, the most powerful thing anyone connected to this story has ever done. It is the decision to say, the grief belongs to me, not to you, not to the cameras, not to the documentaries or the streaming series or the anniversary retrospectives or the people who are going to make content about my sister's deaths for the next 50 years. To me. And that decision, that sustained, private, 25-year decision, is what this video has been building toward since the first frame. Because Lisa Bessette's silence is not the absence of a story. It is the story. There is one more layer to the story of the Bessette sisters that this video has not yet named. The layer that connects what Lisa watched happen to Carolyn inside the Kennedy world to a pattern that this channel has covered before in Joan Kennedy, in Ethel Kennedy, in the women who entered that family and discovered that the institution had specific requirements for the people inside it. What that pattern means for how we understand the crash and what it means for how we understand Lisa's silence is the final piece. That is coming. This channel has spent the better part of a year covering the women who entered the Kennedy world. Joan Kennedy, who married Ted Kennedy at 22 years old and spent 24 years performing loyalty to an institution that gave her no permission to be honest about what performing it cost her, who drank because the specific institutional silence around her pain gave her no other permitted outlet, who was blamed for the drinking rather than the silence. Ethel Kennedy, who crouched over her dying husband on a hotel kitchen floor, 3 months pregnant, and then spent 56 years building things in his name while the world organized its grief around him rather than her. Carolyn Bessette Kennedy, who married a Kennedy and discovered that marrying a Kennedy meant becoming property of a mythology that had been under construction for 60 years before she arrived, who lost weight, who became guarded, who did not want to get on that plane. The pattern across these women is documented. It is not invented by this channel. It is visible in the specific, accumulated record of what the Kennedy world has done to the women inside it across 6 decades. The institution required performance. It required silence about anything that cast shadow on the Kennedy image. It required the women to absorb what the men produced, the affairs, the recklessness, the specific arrogance of men who had been told since childhood that their name made them exceptional, and to do so without complaint and without public acknowledgement of the cost. And when the women could not absorb it, when the cost became visible in ways that the institution could not manage, the institution reframed the woman as the problem. Joan's drinking was the problem, not the marriage. Carolyn's withdrawal was the problem, not the paparazzi. And Lisa Bessette, who was not married to a Kennedy, who had no institutional position inside the Kennedy world, who was simply the sister of a woman who had married into it, watched this pattern operate at close range for 3 years. She watched her sister enter the institution. She watched the institution require things of her sister. She watched her sister change under those requirements. And then she watched her sister die in a plane that her sister had not wanted to board, piloted by a man whose recklessness had been indulged and celebrated his entire life, because his name made recklessness look like adventure rather than what it actually was. And then she watched the institution manage the death, organize the memorial, control the narrative, receive the grief of the world as though the grief were primarily theirs. And then she made her decision. She would not participate, not because she was broken, not because she was unable, but because participation in the specific, documented way that participation in the Kennedy story has always worked would have required her to give the institution what it wanted. A Bessette voice that confirmed the Kennedy version of events. A surviving sister who wept publicly and spoke warmly of John and validated the mythology of the great love story. Lisa Bessette gave the institution none of that. She gave it silence. And the silence, 25 years of it, sustained against the full weight of a culture that has never stopped wanting her to speak, is the most precise and accurate response to the situation she found herself in that it was possible to give. Because the situation she found herself in was this: she had lost both of her sisters. The world had decided whose loss mattered most. And she was the girl who stayed behind in a story that had already decided she was not the point. Her silence says, "I know what you did with my sisters' lives. I know how you organized their deaths. I know the language you used and the institutions you served and the mythologies you protected. And I am not going to help you do it again with my grief." That is not a broken woman. That is a woman who understood exactly what was being asked of her and said no. There is something that this channel has said before in the video about Carolyn, in the video about Lauren, in the video about Joan Kennedy and Ethel Kennedy and Rosemary Kennedy and all the women whose stories this channel exists to tell honestly. The institution does not remember the people it consumes. It remembers the mythology. It remembers JFK Jr., the most eligible bachelor in America, the son of Camelot, the man who flew anyway. It remembers that photograph of him as a 3-year-old, saluting his father's coffin. It remembers the magazine covers. It remembers the George launch party. It remembers the water. It does not remember what it cost Carolyn Bessette to be Mrs. Kennedy. It does not remember that Lauren Bessette was 34 years old and had built something genuinely extraordinary of her own. It does not remember that Anne Freeman lost 2 daughters in one night. And it has never, not once, in 25 years, remembered to say the name of the girl who stayed behind. Lisa Bessette. She is alive. She is somewhere. She has a life that she has built carefully and privately, and without the world's permission or participation. She has chosen, with a consistency that this channel deeply respects, to keep that life her own. She has not written a memoir. She has not given the interview. She has not appeared on the documentary or the streaming series or the anniversary special. She has simply continued to exist as a person, rather than as a character in someone else's mythology. And I want to say something directly to anyone watching this video who has lost someone. Who has watched the world organize someone else's grief around a name that was not your person's name? Who has stood at the edge of a story about someone you loved and recognized that the story was not quite right, that it was missing something, or flattening something, or serving something other than the truth of who that person actually was? Lisa Bessette has been standing at that edge for 25 years. She has watched the world tell her sister's story. She has not corrected it publicly. She has not amplified it. She has not participated in the version of it that the Kennedy mythology required. She has simply continued. And there is something in that continuance that this channel thinks deserves to be named as what it actually is. Not a failure to speak. Not a broken woman who cannot face the world. Not a footnote. A choice. The most sovereign choice available to someone in her position. To say, my grief is mine. My sisters are mine. The specific, private, irreplaceable truth of who Carolyn and Lauren actually were, the truth that existed before the Kennedy name and continued to exist inside the Kennedy world and survived the Kennedy crash, belongs to me. Not to you, not to the cameras, not to the mythology, to me. Lisa Bessette has been making that choice every day for 25 years. This video cannot know what her life looks like, cannot know what she has built, or where she lives, or who she has become, in the privacy she has protected so carefully and for so long. What this video can do, the only thing it can do, is say what the world has failed to say for 25 years. Her name, not Mrs. Kennedy's sister, not the surviving twin, not the girl who stayed behind. Lisa Bessette. She lost both of her sisters in one night. She was 29 years old. She has never asked the world for anything. She has certainly never asked the world to remember her. But this channel thinks that the least the world owes, the people it forgets, the sisters, the twins, the women who stood at the edges of stories that were organized around other people's names, is to say their name clearly. Once. Without a footnote. Without a qualifier. Lisa Bessette. Before you go, I have one question. The world has spent 25 years deciding whose grief in this story mattered most. Does that feel right to you? Leave your answer below. I read every single comment. If this video said something the world has failed to say, please share it. Because the least we can do for the people history forgets is make sure that forgetting them requires a little more effort than it used to. This is Mary of Shadows. Thank you for being here.